This is your daily Facts Matter update, and I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. And now let's begin today's discussion by talking about government censorship. So, as many of you are likely already aware, Joe Rogan, who hosts one of the most popular, if not the most popular podcast on the planet, he is currently facing some severe backlash from most of the establishment players. Now, generally, with the decline in the number of people who actually watch the legacy news outlets, combined with a steady increase in the number of people tuning in to listen to podcasts, specifically to Joe Rogan's podcast, well, perhaps the pressure has been mounting for a while now. Here is, for instance, a graphic which took data from Q3 of last year, from both the Nielsen ratings as well as from Spotify, and it clearly shows that, on average, an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience gets an order of magnitude more viewers than either Fox, MSNBC, CNN, and so on. And when you're looking at that chart, by the way, it's also worth noting that an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience is about typically 3 hours long, whereas those other programs are typically between 20 to 40 minutes long. And so then obviously more and more people are tuning into him and watching his show for a longer length of time. And you would imagine that since Joe Rogan's podcast is quite literally just unfiltered conversations with different people who have different perspectives, well, the American news media would love it. It is, from a certain perspective, the very meaning of American free speech and American free press. And given the fact that he has on there people from all spectrums of the political compass, from Tulsi Gabbard to Candace Owens, from Bernie Sanders to Ben Shapiro, from Milo Yiannopoulos to Matthew Iglesias, that guy from Vox, I mean, he really has conversations with everyone. And one of the draws of his program is that, unlike the legacy news outlets, whose format makes it so you can only really get a soundbite from someone, on the Joe Rogan Experience, the guests have enough time to actually explain their positions and their opinions so that you can evaluate them on their own merits. It's one of the few places online that you can actually go to hear what a person has actually in their mind. However, last month, after Joe Rogan hosted 2 episodes, in which, for one, he spoke with Dr. Robert Malone, who holds several patents to the mRNA technology behind the vaccines, and secondly, with Dr. Peter McCullough, who is a cardiologist, well, things began to turn really sour. That's because both of these guests, they expressed opinions that were contrary to the mainstream narrative regarding both vaccines as well as COVID. Now, I don't want to get into their claims in and of themselves, but right after those episodes actually aired, well, the establishment apparatus, they turned on Joe Rogan as if he was public enemy number one. Here's an example.
People are fundamentally angry about not being able to stop his audience from wanting news that is bad for them, wanting something that's bad for them. So, we're all haunted by the specter of this guy who's listening to Joe Rogan and internalizing this bad information and making bad choices as a result.
Bad information and bad choices, with the assumption being, of course, that the legacy media are the arbiters of good information and they have the exclusive monopoly on knowing what the good choices actually are. Which is probably true given the fact that they are more enlightened than the rest of us. Here's how that interview continued.
Here's people who, they like something that we, who consider ourselves more enlightened, don't think is good for them. We think that they're internalizing this misinformation, that they're using it to make bad decisions.
Then, of course, as you're likely aware, Mr. Neil Young gave Spotify an ultimatum. They can either have his music or the Joe Rogan podcast, but not both. That initiative ultimately failed, and Spotify did remove Neil Young's music. But it led to a cancel campaign with other artists like Joni Mitchell and other podcasts like Science Versus coming out and saying the same thing, that as long as Joe Rogan is on the platform, they will no longer be making content on there. However, here's where things get borderline unconstitutional. Because in this country, we as Americans have the First Amendment, meaning we have the freedom of speech as well as the freedom of the press. And so, while you might have episodes like this where Spotify has to balance their relationship with their listeners, with other content creators, and then with Joe Rogan, well, it becomes an entirely different matter when the government begins to impose on the situation. And that's exactly what happened. To start with, several weeks ago while Joe Biden was speaking to the press, he made this comment regarding media platforms as well as legacy media outlets.
I make a special appeal to social media companies and media outlets. Please deal with the misinformation and disinformation that's on your shows. It has to stop.
And then last week, while he was being interviewed over on MSNBC, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is the U.S. Surgeon General, he said that Silicon Valley tech companies, they have an important role to play in stopping the spread of alleged misinformation. Here's specifically what the Surgeon General said when he was asked specifically about the Joe Rogan podcast as well as about Facebook. We can have the best science available. We can have the best public health expertise available. It won't help people if they don't have access to accurate information. People have the right to make their own decisions, but they also have the right to have accurate information to make that decision with. Now, just to pause here for a quick moment, it's very interesting to hear a government official say that we as Americans have the right to make our own decision, but that at the same time, the information that should be made available to us in order to make that decision, well, it must essentially be given a stamp of government approval in order for us to even have access to it. Regardless, here's how he continues, quote, "This is about companies and individuals recognizing that the only way we get past misinformation is if we are careful about what we say and use the power that we have to limit the spread of misinformation." Now, that can, of course, be seen as a tacit way of requesting social media companies to use their power to limit the spread of alleged misinformation. And it looks like that is exactly what happened. That's because just a few days after this interview, the Spotify CEO, he came out and released a statement saying that the company will begin to add disclaimers to any of their content that mentions COVID, and those disclaimers will lead people to approved sources of information. Here's specifically what that statement said. "We've heard you, especially those from the medical and scientific communities. We are working to add a content advisory to any podcast episode that includes a discussion about COVID-19. This advisory will direct listeners to our dedicated COVID-19 hub, a resource that provides easy access to data-driven facts, up-to-date information as shared by scientists, physicians, academics, and public health authorities around the world, as well as links to trusted sources." However, it looks like the Biden administration did not think that that was enough. That's because right after this change was made, well, Jen Psaki, she was asked about it at a White House press briefing, and here is specifically what she said. "This is a satisfactory step. Our hope is that all major tech platforms and all major news sources, for that matter, be responsible and be vigilant to ensure the American people have access to accurate information on something as significant as COVID-19. That certainly includes Spotify. So this disclaimer, it's a positive step, but we want every platform to continue doing more to call out misinformation and disinformation while also uplifting accurate information. It's a positive step, but there's more that can be done." As the saying goes, 100% of scientists agree when you silence all those who don't. And very naturally, these types of pointed comments raise the very obvious question. At what point does this become an act of outright government censorship? Because on the surface, you do have a veneer of plausible deniability. I mean, the government is, of course, not passing laws saying that this needs to be done. But when you have the Surgeon General and you have the White House themselves coming out and putting pressure on Spotify to censor a certain host, well, it is beginning to look like government censorship with a few extra steps. Regardless, Joe Rogan did release a statement on this matter, and here's what he said in part, although I did have to speed up the video a little bit just so it wouldn't be so long.
"The problem I have with the term misinformation, especially today, is that many of the things that we thought of as misinformation just a short while ago are now accepted as fact. Like, for instance, 8 months ago, if you said, if you get vaccinated, you can still catch COVID and you can still spread COVID, you would be removed from social media. They would ban you from certain platforms. Now, that's accepted as fact. If you said, I don't think cloth masks work, you would be banned from social media. Now, that's openly and repeatedly stated on CNN. If you said, I think it's possible that COVID-19 came from a lab, you'd be banned from many social media platforms. Now, that's on the cover of Newsweek.
If you'd like to read more about this government censorship and the way that it's actually playing out, I'll throw the links to several articles into the description box below this video. And all I ask in return is that you take a super quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm.